Okay, boys and girls, once you've finished weaving on your loom, it's going to be time to remove it. Here we have a partially woven board, so half the board's been woven on, the other half isn't, and the warp strings are still visible. And this one's done and it's ready to be removed. One of the first steps that you need to do is, if you haven't been, as you've been weaving, make certain that you're taking and compressing your weaving up towards the top of the board, so the warp strings in here are no longer visible. So all we can see is just the weft going back and forth. Once you've compressed it together, the next step is to take your last end, the very end of your last weft string that you have, and just like we did all the way up here at the beginning, go ahead and tie this end to whichever warp string it stops on. So simply take and loop it around. Make certain that you're capturing that warp string in there. So the warp string should be captured inside of that little loop, and then just simply tuck the end through that loop, and just like you've been doing, go ahead and pull that, and it creates a nice knot that secures all of your weft weaving to that final piece of that warp where it touches. Next, we need to go ahead and trim away all of these knots. Any of the knots that you have, and remember we're looking at the back of the board right now, any of the knots that you have, any long tails that you have, now is the time to go ahead and take care of trimming them. So let's zoom in on this right here. When you are trimming the knot, you do not want to trim right up to the absolute edge of that knot. Instead, you want to make certain that you're leaving a little bit of that tail visible. So if your loom gets any type of rough handling, you can be assured that your knots are not going to come undone. So you're just going to go ahead and trim these knots and all these little tidbits of yarn that you get from trimming out those knots. We don't want those for anything. We don't need them for anything. I want you guys to just go ahead and put all of those into the garbage. If you'd like to trim out your tails at both the end and the beginning where you started, you can definitely go ahead and trim those. But again, don't trim them so low that you run the risk of that knot coming undone. So take these, go ahead and get rid of those into the garbage. Next, once we have all of the knots trimmed, we want to go ahead and flip our board over where we can see the ends of the warp strings are being held in place by tape. So carefully, without trying to rip the board, remove the tape from the top string and from the bottom string. Again, these need to go into the garbage. Flip the board back over, and then now it's time to go ahead and cut these warps. You have lots of options about what you could potentially do with the warps, but the safest option for right now is to take the scissors, and you're going to go ahead and cut right at the base, right next to where those tabs are. What you don't want to do is cut up here. Don't cut up here. We need it to be long enough that you can actually tie all of the knots that you need. You're going to be tying these in pairs. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and wait, there's 3 left. How can we have a pair like that? Simply take 2 and put them together, and then you'll have your last pair that way. So take your scissors, cut here at the bottom, just go ahead and cut those. And you'll see the tension being released as it's springing up, and that's that. So you've got your warp strings cut. Next, we want to take these warp strings in pairs and tie them into square knots, so that way all of our weft weaving is nice and secure. So let's go ahead and zoom in here on one of these pairs, and you're simply going to take, and it's almost like tying your shoelace, you're going to take the 2 and tie those together. So you make a cross, so you cross the 2 together, and then this one that's underneath, and I know it's hard to tell because it's black on black, you're going to take the one end, tuck it through that hole that's right there, and then simply pull that, so that way your knot ends up right at the bottom of your weaving. And then do that again, do that twice, so then you're creating what's called a square knot. So go ahead and double knot that, so you're creating a square knot, and now you have your first pair, your first knot done. And for right now, just go ahead and let all of those warp strings hang out, just let them dangle until you've gone through and you've tied every single other pair of knots. We've gone through, all of these have been tied into pairs, and now we have an odd number left, remember. So we're just going to take one by itself and the two together, and same exact process with these. Make that crisscross, put the end through the loop, go ahead and pull that, and then make it into a double knot, so you do that same process one more time. And when that's all done, your warps have been trimmed, your knots have been made, and now you can go ahead and remove this right off the loom, and it's as simple as literally just taking it and popping it right off there. And you have a nice front, so that was the back we were looking at, and here's the front. And if you've got these tabs, what you could do is you could put a little piece of dowel rod through there and make this into a hanging piece. If you want to disguise those, you just simply take some of your weaving, because it's been compressed really well, and you can fluff it up towards the top a little bit, and you can see that those disappear. You've got some options. You could leave these hanging, you could trim those away, you could add beads to them, lots of different things that you could choose to do to make this a little bit more finished. Here we have a full board weaving. So the weaving has stretched all the way from the very top of the warp strings all the way to the bottom of the warp strings. If you have a whole board weaving, the process of removing it from the loom is just a little bit different than the partial weaving. So the first thing that we'll do here is, if you haven't, go ahead and compress everything up, so that way all of your weft strings that you've woven are nice and secure. And just like we did with the partial board weaving, the very end of your weaving, this loose string that's right here, you want to tie it to the corner of the warp that it ends on. So mine happens to end on this left edge. Yours could end on any of those warp strings. So let's go ahead and zoom in there. And if your weaving runs all the way down to the bottom, you might find it's a little difficult to see that warp string. So what you can do is just push it up a little bit, and it helps expose a little bit more of it. So I'm going to take this end of my weft, I'm going to tuck it underneath my warp, and you can see that I've captured this warp string inside of the loop that I've made. And I just want to go ahead and tuck the end of my weft, my yellow string, in there, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to slide this knot down so it rests directly on my warp string. So I've captured my warp string inside of my knot, and now it's all secured on there, and I can just simply cover that back up. Our next step is to go ahead and trim out these tails of our knots. So where we knotted one string to another, remember this is the back of our weaving that we're looking at, and we most likely probably want to trim these knots out. If it's not important to you to trim those knots and they're not too obtrusive, you're welcome to go ahead and leave them there. But if you would like to trim them, what you should do is go ahead and trim them close to where the knot is, but you don't want to trim right at that actual knot. So leave a little bit of a tail, and all of these little tidbits of yarn that you create, just go ahead and put those into the garbage. So if you have used a lot of different strings of different lengths, you might have quite a few knots that you need to trim. If you use longer lengths, you might not have quite as many knots that you need to trim. And again, if you don't want to trim those knots out, it's not a requirement. This is your work. If you'd like to leave them as they are, as I leave some of my weavings with the knots, you're welcome to go ahead and leave those with some of yours. But all these little tidbits that you create with the cutting of the knots, please go ahead and put all of those into the garbage. So you're going to gather those up and you're going to put those into the garbage. Next, we want to flip our board over, and we're going to see those two pieces of tape that are holding down the very ends of the warp strings. You want to go ahead and carefully, gently remove that tape so we don't rip the board. So tape number 1 at the top, tape number 2 at the bottom. Go ahead and remove those and take these pieces of tape and also put those into the garbage. And now removing your weaving from a full board weave is actually a little bit faster than you might have seen with the partial. If you have these edges of the warp strings, you are welcome after you get it off the board to go ahead and trim it off. If they really bother you now, you're welcome to go ahead and take and trim those little bits before you do that as well too. So either way works. I'll show you trimming it after we take it off. So you can see, we're looking at the back of the board, you can see those little tabs that have the warp threads on there. All you're going to do is carefully, emphasis on the word carefully, stretch these to just go ahead and pop off right over those tabs. You don't want to pull hard down on the tabs because you don't want to bend the tabs, because then the loom may not work properly, but you're just going to carefully stretch it right over, and you're just going to simply pop those off right there. And then you'll have the big reveal in just a moment with your loom. If you find some of them are a little bit tight, just go extra slow so you don't bend your tabs. So just like so, I'm going to lay this down, and then the top's going to be super easy to remove. I'm just going to pop it right out, and then voila! There is your weaving, and this is the front of your weaving. This is what had been laying up against the board, and you'd been looking at the back this whole time. Now, here is the front. If you can see that we can see some of those warp strings still visible at the bottom, you could leave those there if you'd like. They could work as part of the decoration. If you want to disguise those, you can simply take and shift down some rows of your weft weaving, and you can see how those disappear pretty well. Whether you've done a partial board weaving or a full board weaving, you technically could be done with this project. So you could keep it like this, you can keep it like this, very simple, where the main focus is just on the actual texture that you create with the weaving. You can leave the warp threads visible, or you can hide the warp threads if you'd like. If you leave your warp threads visible, you can leave them plain, or like this example on this partial weaving, you can see I chose to go ahead and add some beads, and I knotted the beads onto the visible warp threads that were available. A full board weaving, you could, if you wanted to, you have these big loops at the bottom from the warps that you can see. You can add some tassels on there, and I can show you guys how to do tassels. It's simply just cut bits of yarn that have been looped through the bottom part of the warp, and then you just let them hang and they just look nice and full. You can use construction paper scraps to cut, draw, design, decorate, cut some things out, and then these are simply applied with Elmer's glue. This one I like to use as a decorative hanging piece, so the warp threads that you can see at the top, I go ahead and I put a dowel rod through them so I can use this to hang up anywhere. Really, the possibilities for what you choose to do with your weaving are very, very endless. You could keep it simple, or let your imagination run wild with as far as what you could do with your finished work.